Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Criminal Justice Issues panel. I don't think that's the formal name of it, but essentially we're going to be discussing a lot of different cutting-edge criminal justice reform issues here today, and you have an outstanding panel. I'm Ellen Rosenblum, Oregon Attorney General. Delighted to be the moderator, so I'll just start with a few opening comments, introduce the panelists, and then we have kind of a series of sort of questions in different areas that we'll be covering today, and we will also leave time for Q&A. But just to give you an idea, some of the topics we'll be discussing include police profiling, pretrial detention and money bail, hate crimes, women in prison, officer use of force, and police accountability. Those are just a few of quite a number of topics that we have on tap for our 1 hour and 15 minutes time slot today. Yeah. So like all functions of government, our criminal justice depends on a public belief in its fairness for its legitimacy. In order to prosecute a crime victim or a witness must trust the sanctity of the courthouse and the fairness of prosecutors enough to be willing to come forward and share what they saw with a grand jury or a judge without fear or hesitation. In order to investigate a crime, members of our community must trust our police enough to call 911 and trust that this decision will not result in undesired consequences for themselves or members of their community. And across it all, the community must trust that any sentence imposed is being imposed fairly and evenly, without regard to race, class, religion, creed, or any other factor that's not related to a person's criminal conduct. These are factors that contribute positively to system legitimacy. The disproportionate use of force against communities of color decreases system legitimacy. Chronic and widespread discrepancies in arrests decreases system legitimacy. The constant threat of arrest by immigration authorities, even within the courthouse itself, decreases system legitimacy. And the over-criminalization of houselessness and mental illness decreases system legitimacy. So I could go on and on like this, but the important point is that these individual moments of friction are all cumulative, each serving as a crack in the edifice of our criminal justice system. And left untended, these cracks can spread far enough and deep enough that the system itself finally starts to crumble in the eyes of those it was meant to serve. So let me share a few relevant statistics. Drug use rates do not vary significantly by race and ethnicity, but despite this, a national ACLU study determined that blacks were 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites. This was in the year 2010, so a while ago. But despite comparable usage, those were the statistics then. A 2016 study by the Oregon's Criminal Justice Commission confirmed that the same discrepancies have historically existed here in Oregon. So don't think that was a long time ago, that was somewhere else. It's still here. A MacArthur study of Multnomah County jail data suggested that blacks are up to 6 times more likely than whites to be in jail at any given time relative to their representation in the overall population. This, in turn, is occurring simultaneously with a growing issue of white supremacy and violence, which is designed to make our diverse communities feel less safe by exposing them to growing levels of harassment, threats, hate, and bias crime. And each of these points is another crack in the edifice. Democrats must continue to respond to these challenges. And in recent years, the legislature has pushed forward a series of significant policy packages meant to take this challenge head on. And I was honored to partner with our legislative leaders in passing House Bill 2355 during the 2017 legislative session, which stands against police profiling by obligating our law enforcement partners to tell us who they are stopping, who they are arresting, who they are searching, and whether they're finding anything. This bill also defelonized low-level drug possession in Oregon, a change that has resulted in significantly reduced disparities since then in stops and arrests for this type of offense. So that is working, and that is a very good thing. In the last session, I joined with legislative partners to push Senate Bill 577, the most comprehensive reforms to our hate crimes statutes in Oregon in over 30 years. This bill, which focuses foremost on improved delivery of trauma-informed, culturally competent services to the victims and communities directly impacted by hate and bias, especially in our rural and frontier counties, has been described by the Arab American Institute, the Anti-Defamation League, and others as the most comprehensive anti-hate crime protections anywhere in the country. So we should all be very proud. The legislators responsible for that are right here. Some of them, and some of them most responsible. And so this is really a great room to be in this afternoon. And finally, while we may sometimes use the term historic a little too freely, there really is no other word sufficient to describe the scope of the accomplishment of passing Senate Bill 1008, a truly generational reform to our system of juvenile justice. And hopefully we'll have some time to discuss that with you too. But the road to a fair criminal justice system is long, and we are simply not there yet. A multitude of issues remain to be addressed, including our system of pretrial detention, money bail, over-imposition of fines and fees, all the concerns about disproportionality in police use of force, among many others. And so I asked when we were contacted about what might be a good topic for a panel, which the wonderful DPO staff goes around and does several months in advance, I suggested this topic. So I'm honored to be joined by our panelists today, and I'd like to take just a moment to introduce each of them, even though they are very well known, especially our two legislators. The other one, I don't know, not so much. I better tell you about him. The guy in the middle, yeah, I gotta tell you a little bit more about him when we get to that. But first, to my immediate left here is our wonderful Senator James Manning Jr. His background, he has served as a state corrections officer, a police officer, a private investigator, and has served our country with an extensive run of distinguished military service with the United States Army. This gives him a non-theoretical, boots-on-the-ground insight into the ways our laws impact the lives of our defendants and our incarcerated populations, sometimes in unexpected and even counterproductive ways. He has a deep, applied knowledge of the actual lived realities of often academic terms like rehabilitation and recidivism. Senator Manning was appointed to the Oregon Senate in 2016, and of course, subsequently elected, where he represents Senate District 7. So thank you, Senator Manning, for joining us today. And for a total treat if you haven't had a chance to meet him before. Skipping over Aaron in the middle for a moment, Senator Frederick, who everyone knows, he is, in a word, legendary, especially in issues of racial justice and system reform. In recent years, I've taken on a series of policy issues. I have taken on a series of policy issues meant to promote fairness and proportionality in the criminal justice system. And without fail, Senator Frederick has been working on them far longer than I have. With his deep roots in progressive advocacy and his acute understanding of the specific challenges facing our diverse youth, Senator Frederick has long been a thoughtful and dedicated advocate for juvenile justice. Senator Frederick joined the House of Representatives, serving House District 43, and moved to the Senate in 2016, where he served Senate District 22. He is truly an elder statesman. He's not old, but he's an elder statesman. And I gotta be careful. Elder goes with statesman in issues of equity and criminal justice. And we are honored to have him with us today. And yes, I'm going to have to admit that Oregon Department of Justice Legislative Director Ellen Knott is something of an insider pick for me, but bear with me. As my legislative director, Aaron has served as the chair of both the task forces on the prevention of hate crimes and the profiling task force, and he was the primary technical drafter of both bills. So we have a real expert in our midst. He's the sort of guy who admits to hanging out in the House and Senate Judiciary Committees for fun. and I'm often baffled by his ability to give me spontaneous updates on pretty much any subject in criminal justice. as such, he's a very good lifeline to have around for any technical questions, and I think our legislators have figured that out. Before coming to me as our legislative director, a position he has held pretty much as long as I've held this position, since 2012, Aaron worked as a prosecutor in the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. He also served as Judiciary Committee Counsel during the 2011 session, and I'll just tell my own little story about him. How I found him was I got a call one day from Senator Floyd Przansky, and it was just a voicemail, but he said, I assume that you're going to pick Aaron Knott as your legislative policy director. And I'm thinking to myself, who the heck is Aaron Knott, right? But once I found out, it was clear that he was absolutely the right pick. So thank you, Aaron, for joining us today. And I am going to shut up in a few minutes here because I know you want to hear from them. But in terms of format, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask each panelist, if they wish, to give a brief opening remark, and it can be hopefully fairly short, just a couple of minutes. And then we're going to move to a series of panel questions, which they can answer. They can't really interrupt each other because we only have one mic, but we will all be generous with our time with the mic, and we'll get through as many of our questions as we have time for. And as I said, I will leave 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions because I'm sure you have some as well. So if we might start with Senator Manning, let me give you if you want to come up here, or do you want to hold the mic? You want to come up here?
Yeah, I'll stand up.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
First off, let me thank the Attorney General. You got to give it up to Ellen. She has done I have seen her at work, traveling throughout the state, looking at subjects like racial injustice, intolerance, discriminations. I've seen her hold forums in other communities around the state. I've not seen that out of any other state attorney general. So we have a very special one. And, you know, I've got a lot of work that I need to get done, and she is directly connected with that. So I think she's running. I throw this in there. We got to get her reelected. So I'm told that I have a few seconds or moments to speak, so I will be brief. I just want to do a little correction. My good friend and colleague, Senator Frederick, I think it was referred to as the elder statesman. I gotta say that in the Senate, Senator Frederick is junior to me.
How many hours are we talking about?
Well, it doesn't matter about the hours, you know. We will go down. I had my choice of Senate desk, office, and parking space before. But he has more knowledge about the legislative process. So I guess in no sense, he is the elder statesman, and we'll go with that. But I am so honored to be here. There are a lot of issues that we have that's going on in the state, and not only the state, but across the country. We have a lot of work to do. One, we're talking about criminal justice reform. What does that look like? How criminal justice reform is also associated with social justice reform. How social justice reform is also associated with housing, jobs, lack of jobs, how we're going to have living wage, not minimum wage. There are a lot of things that tie us all together, and it all comes down to, funnel down to this thing about why are we locking people up as a solution to a problem that we have invented. We have invented this problem of homelessness because we raised the rate of rent so high people can't afford them, so they're out on the street. So what happens to that? Now we got ordinance, local ordinance that criminalize this. We have been doing this thing. I spent 24 years in the Army, and I'm going to sit down on this. And every time I would do a permanent change of station, PCS, and I get to my next duty station, and I find out that they have been doing a particular job or task the same way And I would ask them why. And they say, we've always done it this way. And I would say, have you ever considered that you've always done it wrong?
All right. I got to tell you, it's already fairly intimidating to be on a panel with two senators, but two senators and your boss is really particular. But I am on vacation right now, so it does not create a conflict of interest for me to say everyone should vote for my boss. She is right, though. I spend all my time in the Judiciary Committee. I love it there. I don't know why. But that means I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of public safety bills come and go. And I want to emphasize two things. The first one is that when I got started on this in 2011, we weren't having this conversation the same way. I am amazed at the fire that has caught over justice, equity, and avoiding disparate impacts in our criminal justice system. I mean, in 2011, the conversation was going, but it was not like this. I am amazed at the progress that has been made in a short time. I am so impressed by the work the legislature has done. But number two, I get asked sometimes, because I spend so much time in judiciary, Aaron, what are the bills that we should watch from an equity perspective? What are the bills we should watch from a diversity perspective? And what I tell that person is, they are all equity bills. This is the point that the senator before me, I think, was making in part, not to put words in a senator's mouth, that's dangerous. But this stuff ties together. I mean, it doesn't matter if we're talking about drunk driving, it doesn't matter if we're talking about search and seizure, it doesn't matter about how we supervise people that are on probation. All of this is equity. And if we can't be holistic in our thinking about the system, we will never change it. If that's one thing I've learned from hanging out in judiciary, it's that. Everything connects. So thank you everyone for having me. I'm excited to try to keep up with everyone else. So.
Be kind.
Be kind?
No begging.
Oh my. I'm going to be as quick as I possibly can because I want to get to the questions. But I want to just, you're going to hear an echo here. We are all looking at this in terms of the impact of the judicial system on community and on people and on their future. And so I will just point out one particular example of that. We passed a bill in 2017 that dealt with profiling. Now, it was the second profiling bill we had passed. We passed one in 2015, and then we did one in 2017. And in 2017, that particular bill, as you heard, called for the police to track who they were talking to regularly and pulling over and who they were arresting. But a portion of that bill that came by way of the Oregon Sheriff's Association and Chiefs of Police was called for a defelonization of possession of a controlled substance. Now, we had the DAs who were not happy with that because they wanted to use that as a leverage point, but it passed. I thought, yeah, that's great, we'll see what happens over time. In 1 year, they decided to take a look at what had happened. And what happened was, one DA in particular in Multnomah County said he was not going to be prosecuting folks. And so the number of arrests for possession of a controlled substance dropped by 90%. Wow. Now that was impressive. The number of African American folks who were arrested went from 300 per 10,000 to 50 per 10,000. That's a drop as well. So I said, wow, that's amazing. Then I went and I talked with some of my friends who were on the police force or had been on the police force. And they gave me an explanation that I think is important as we look at these issues. Their explanation was, it's not an official tally, but it's a competition among the police officers on how many felons they pull over. And if you only get a misdemeanor charge, it doesn't count. So you don't bother certain people anymore. And guess who they don't bother anymore? People of color. Because they no longer can be guaranteed that they're going to get some kind of a felon felony conviction or felony charge. So they stopped doing it, and we started to see a drop. That's going to impact the school to prison pipeline. It's going to impact what happens in terms of getting jobs, housing, education, just having a family. For me, the major issue is how we make sure we start to recover and create strong communities and families. That's what I want to see happen. And the approach that we've taken in the past, which is primarily punishment, punish as much as possible, not rehabilitation, although we try to give that some lip service. This changes that, and I want to see how we can do this in as many ways as possible. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all so much. That's a perfect segue to our first topic, which is profiling. So I think we already had this one teed up pretty well. But just to remind you, in 2015, the Oregon Legislature passed House Bill 2002, which made Oregon at that time the 31st state, so we certainly weren't the first, to explicitly prohibit profiling by law enforcement as a matter of state law. But what we did in 2017 really took it to the next level, and we are definitely among only a very few states, I believe, that have done what we've done. This created for the first time a statewide requirement that our law enforcement track and report who's being stopped, who's being arrested, who's being searched, who's being let off with just a warning. And for the past year, Oregon's Criminal Justice Commission, and I see our director here, Mike Schmidt, raise your hand. Thank you, Mike. Great job. The commission has been collecting data submitted by the dozen largest law enforcement entities in Oregon and is preparing a report due in January. I hope you know that, Mike. Which should, for the first time, provide a comprehensive statewide view of the specific policing practices of individual law enforcement entities, particularly as to their treatment of communities of color. So I'd like to ask our panelists to please comment on the importance of this law and any questions that you have moving forward around the issue of profiling that we should make sure to be addressing.
Thank you. I was a member of the Eugene Police Commission for a number of years before I got into the state senate. And in Eugene, we did the first prohibited profiling policy in the state in Eugene. And Eugene has been moving forward on a lot of those issues when you talk about how you interact with the public. One of the things, I've attended a number of training sessions with law enforcement, and they used to use the term very loosely, the bad guy. That term is really loaded. I spent 24 years active duty Army, and when I use the word bad guy, I refer to the enemy. We, the people here, are not the enemy of law enforcement. And we have to change the mindset. So when you're being looked on as the enemy, meaning that you are more subject, more prone to be profiled. So we have to undo, again, we've always did it this way. Well, we have been doing it wrong for so many years, and we're steady using the same methodology. I was also a member of the Oregon Commission on Black Affairs, OCBA, when Senator Frederick was our legislator, House member that was connected to it. So at the state level, we had been working on this bill for a long time. And I even had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., where I spoke to then the President Obama's cabinet secretary, and I explained to him, we have to look at the people that we have that are entrusted with the power of life and death and how they see things. But I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Thank you.
And I think I'll stay seated. You know, when we were putting this bill together, I would get the question occasionally, why are you so concerned about data? You know, we all know profiling's happening in our communities. Why do you need to know about data? And just to give a short example of why I think it's so important. So let's say you're a traffic cop on the side of I-5, and your job is to pull people over for speeding. I tell everybody speeds on I-5 except the Attorney General. Typically, I drive to Salem. I maintain about a 72 south of Wilsonville and about 18 north of Wilsonville. But if you think about it from the perspective of a traffic officer, that means that every single person you pull over, it's a lawful stop. They were all speeding. Every single one of those instances, those interactions taken in isolation, is completely lawful. It is not until you have the ability to aggregate them together that you find out that that particular officer is pulling over people of color at a percentage that you can track, 50%, 60%, 70%, more than they should be, more than other officers. I mean, we'll be able to parse this. And I want to tell you the data point I'm the most excited about. So we looked heavily at law in Connecticut when we put this thing together. And they'd already had a few rounds of data come back. And the thing they were really excited about was this data point about who's being searched and how often is something being found. Because that one is the, hey, can I look in your bag? Hey, where are you going? Can I look in your bag? Hey, where are you going? Can I look in your bag? And when you find out that those, hey, where are you going? Can I look in your bag stops result in the discovery of some sort of evidence that's relevant to some sort of a charge, say 70% of the time, okay, I think it's a defensible police practice. But when you find out it's 2% of the time, not only is that start to raise an indicia of profiling, depending on who's being searched, it's a waste of time. It's bad policing. You're not getting any cases out of it. Officers are literally spending their time on nothing. And sometimes they don't even realize that. Some of the law enforcement entities that were approached in Connecticut said, wow, we didn't realize we were only getting a hit, 1 out of every 100 people we're stopping. And we're about to have that insight here, and I think it's going to be tremendously valuable, not just for our policymakers, but for law enforcement entities themselves about how to police more intelligently.
Thank you. Well, a lot of my discussion, a lot of my motivation is a personal one. Now that I have gray hair, as opposed to my Senate colleague,
You weren't going to get away with that. I asked him to be kind.
Now that I have gray hair, I'm not pulled over as much as I used to. I'm always obeying the speed limit on I-5 between Salem and, yeah, right. But the fact is, I was often pulled over as I was driving through Irvington neighborhood in Portland. And I'd be pulled over, at least 3 times I was pulled over by a police officer who, the last time when he pulled me over, when a fellow pulled me over, he said, are you okay? I mean, you're driving pretty slowly through the neighborhood. I thought maybe you were lost. And I said, no, I'm not lost. In fact, I live right here. Now, my neighborhood is gentrified now. And he did not expect to see me in the neighborhood. The profiling situation for me is, again, personal. Driving on a bright, clear, sunny day, the light turns on, and I turn left, appropriate with the light. As I'm heading down a path there, the police car pulls me over. And I've got to say, the fact is, whenever I see a police car pull me over, or a police car behind me, my first thought is, am I going to die today? Right. So that's my first thought. And then when he pulls me over, in this particular situation, the fellow pulled me over, and he said, I noticed that you have a bright light in your tail light has a white light there, and you need to get that fixed. And I said, this is a bright sunny day. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We're not talking about, but it was a white light. And I said, okay, thank you. I didn't notice that there was anything bright. I got out and looked at my tail light, and it did have a white light, and it was a perfect circle. In the light. And I went, I wonder how I got that. Then, you don't back up into anything. Several months later, I was talking with a friend of mine who happens to be a former police chief. And I asked him about that. He said, oh, that's the pen and the light routine. We wanted to pull you over to see just who you were. And so he took his pen and he took it and popped a perfect circular hole in the tail light. It was a way of profiling and checking as many people as possible. The police officer wasn't particularly upset or angry at anything. He was following the pattern that had been suggested to him by earlier officers. This is an issue that we're going to continue to look at and try to figure out in terms of training. We did two things this last session that I was really pleased with, that deal with training, that try to catch it upstream of those kinds of incidents. The anxiety level is a significant one that we have for police officers and obviously for people who are pulled over. We set it up so now every police agency in the state has a psychological screening for police officers. They did not before. And in fact, it was a surprise to the chiefs of police and the Sheriff's Association that they did not everyone. There were people who, as one sheriff said, listen, if I want to hire my crazy cousin, I'm going to do that. And could get away with it. The other thing that we did was we put in every agency is supposed to deal with a wellness program. Now, again, people said, well, why? Well, we have two wellness programs in the state that are internationally known. One is in Bend, the other one is in Hillsborough. And the idea there is very simply to get folks to bring down their anxiety level. Constantly bring down their anxiety level so that they don't start off at this height when they see somebody. And if they see someone of color, because of the culture that we live in, I'm scary. I'm terrifying. And anyone who, any black person, any Latino person, anybody tall or large is somehow scary immediately. If we can start to bring down that kind of anxiety level, then we start to change some things and we start to deal with some of the other profiling issues. That's what I'm looking at.
Thank you all so much, and for sharing your personal stories as well, your daily lives. Hate crimes seems like a good follow-on. That's the other task force that my office led, and again, Erin worked very closely with our amazing legislators to get this bill through. It was actually in some jeopardy, so I cannot thank you enough, senators, for making sure that it happened when it needed to happen. Because in the aftermath of the 2016 presidential election, we all know we witnessed a surge of hate and bias-related violence across the nation. And Oregon was certainly not spared. In fact, we were among the worst. We were 11th in total hate crimes reported in the 10 days following the presidential election. And that's a figure not adjusted for total population. Similarly, the FBI reported that Oregon's number of hate crimes reported increased over 60% from 2015 to 16. Despite this, the prosecution of hate crimes has fallen roughly 50% from its peak in the 2000s. So in response to these concerns, my office joined with both of you, in addition to other legislators, to develop Senate Bill 577, which made the most profound reforms to our hate crime statutes in over 30 years and made needed progress in providing direct relief to the communities victimized by bias. Still, the questions remain. Why are these crimes increasing? And what is the obligation of the state and of our legislature in continuing to combat them? Who wants to start?
Thank you. Amazing. Imagine this. A couple of years ago, a House representative member was knocking on doors, and a lady called the police on her for knocking on the doors. And it made national attention. Oregon has been in the national light on a lot of issues. Unfortunately, this was one that I wish wasn't in that light, but it happened. It's a day in a life. Imagine going out just to have a conversation. Imagine just sitting in a hotel that you've already registered as a guest and you already paid, and you get removed not because you did anything, but just because the color of your skin. Imagine just walking down the street or recently in a shopping mall and security calls the police on your daughter, who's doing everything, same thing that any other teenager does in a mall. Imagine the stigma. Imagine what that does to your self-worth. So, what we have is a continuation of policies or training that's always been wrong. When we choose law enforcement, that is a job that everybody cannot do.
Right.
And we have to, Senator Frederick alluded to this sheriff said he can hire his crazy cousin. His crazy cousin would not fit. Because who are the people that you are associated with? Who are the people that are influencing your decision making? As a former police officer, I know you have older officers that have been on the job for some times that have gained a lot of biases. It says this is the way to go. We want to go where the action is. Where the action is. Well, the action is where places where you assume you can go and do just about anything you want and have no repercussion. Recently, a young lady got life in prison for stealing or allegedly stealing a $125 jacket. Another lady went into a man's apartment, shot and killed him, and she got 10 years. So we have to look at the mentality, who is influencing us? Where is this coming from? I would argue that we have someone that's in the highest office in this land that has given a green light, and it is germinating. But more importantly, we have to stop it at home.
Right.
Our children is the turning point. And if we teach them right now, that's how we're going to turn this thing around.
When we were working on the hate crimes bill, the Attorney General and our task force visited a number of different cities in Portland and asked people to tell us their stories. And I think we were joined by both of the senators at one time or another and some other people in the room. And I remember one woman in particular. She was a Somali woman who told a story. And she said, you know, I was just walking down the street, guy pulls up, big truck, big white truck, practically goes up on the sidewalk. And he gets out and he starts yelling right out of the gate. And I'm not going to repeat the things he yelled because you all know what they are. But what I want you to know is that it was at the top of his lungs. It was laden with profanity. You know, you're a terrorist. I hope your children end up in camps. Things like that. And, you know, spit flying out of his mouth. And people are watching. No one intervened, by the way. People just watched. And then, and this was in Portland. And then he got in his car, you know, parted with one more profanity and drove off. And she, crying, called 911 and said, I've been the victim of a hate crime. I said, okay, tell me about it. And she told her story. I said, well, all right. Did he threaten you with violence? I mean, did he say he was going to harm you directly right now? And she said, no, not like that. I mean, she said I hope bad things happen to you, but not that he'd do them themselves. Okay. Did he ever raise his fist? No. Did he ever touch you? No. Did he spit on you? No. Well, I'm sorry, ma'am, that's not a crime. Right. And that was that for that woman and her trauma. And as a matter of constitutional law, that was probably right. I mean, how many people here know that Oregon has the strongest freedom of speech protections in the country? Yeah, and most of the time it's like, wow, good for us. Nothing is that simple. And so Oregon is a particularly difficult place for victims of hate. I am prouder of the hate crimes bill than anything I've ever worked on, and here's why. It recognized that that person, despite the fact that there may not have been a prosecutable crime, was a victim and did suffer trauma and deserves treatment, services, counseling, safety planning. The obligation of the state to take care of people that are the victims of hate and bias should not, and now in Oregon does not, turn on whether there is a prosecutable offense. And, you know, hate crimes are different than any other type of crime in one significant regard. The person who is victimized is not the only victim. The point of a hate crime is that they will go back to their community and say, I did not get help. I could not find counseling or resources. I and everyone who looks like me needs to look over their shoulder in this community forever, because no one is coming to help. And Senate Bill 577, 30 years we've had a hate crimes law. This is the first time I think we have said it is about the victim, and it is about making them whole.
I'm going to ask that you applaud once again, because I've got to tell you, Aaron did one hell of a job. And the Attorney General went around the state and really pushed and worked on this thing. This did not come easily. It did not come quickly. It was required that they really put themselves out and work on these things, and they did it. It was just astounding. It is one of those things where when you talk with your friends in other states, talk about this, because they made it very clear that they were going to make a change. And the hate crime situations, the day after the election, on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in my district, in front of the convention center, there were guys driving down with Confederate flags on the back, yelling at anyone who was of color, and yelling all sorts of threatening things at them during that time. We have this bill speaks to that particular situation. It attempts to speak to a change in the media narrative that folks can get away with whatever they want to do. That's a huge change. Now, we've already had one prosecution on this.
Yeah.
Is that right? And I think that we've had several. I think that it will begin to be part of the narrative, the cultural narrative that says, no, you can't get away with this. But it's going to take a while for us to do that kind of thing. Again, I go back to my own personal situation. I grew up in the South. I desegregated my high school in Atlanta, Georgia. And on my first day in, I had people yelling and screaming at me, and I had fellow students screaming at me for the next 5 years. High school in Atlanta was 8th through 12th grade. Just so that you know, I did actually make it out before at the right time. But it was something that I had to deal with, and it was something that we worked through. There was not a lot I could do in that time. 1964, they were yelling at me, they were yelling at folks in Tuskegee, they were doing all sorts of other things in Selma and other places. So it was okay for folks to do those kinds of things, and they would get support from their community for doing it. We are changing that narrative, and it takes a while sometimes, but we are changing that narrative, and I am so proud of what we were able to do this session, and proud of these two people, because these three people, but especially in terms of the expectation was not necessarily that we would get that done, and if we had to fight for this, but we did get it done, and it was an extraordinary event. So again, thank you.
I'm just going to add something to that, because of course when you do get good legislation passed, often that gives your office that promoted it homework to do. And we have a lot of homework, and I'm proud we're already working very hard to set up the implementation of the hate crimes bill, because it wasn't just a change in the law, in the definitions of hate crimes and such, and the penalties, but it also set up this process that will be run out of our office, Erin and my office, and it is being led by our new Civil Rights Director, Faye Stetzwater. So I want to make sure, she's not able to be here this weekend, but I want you to remember her name and I want you to contact her. She's leading the steering committee on the hate crimes bill. She's basically coordinating. We'll be hiring a coordinator who will work with her, because it's going to take a lot to make sure that every single person who is the victim of a bias incident or a bias crime, but it's particularly a bias incident that does not rise to the level of a crime because of the reasons that Aaron noted, has a response and has a trauma-informed response to their situation. And so we're working on that as we speak, and it is very exciting. And I also want to just call out a few people who are here, because this is an amazing group of people who've chosen this workshop. And I see at least three additional legislators in the room. So one is actually the former police chief of the city of Gresham, Carla Peluso, Another is Pam Marsh from Southern Oregon. Another is, I saw Representative Nose, I'm not sure if he's still here. And we also have with us Congresswoman Bonamici has been here. She may have had to go, but she was here just till a couple of minutes ago. And that means a lot, because you know, is Rep. Gorsuch here too? I didn't see him. Oh my gosh, there you are. Thank you. And Senator Taylor is in the back, Kathleen Taylor. So this is an amazing room, and all of you are so valued and important to us. But I did want to note that the reason I think that they're here, not only is that they also get credit and worked on this, because that's not why they came. They didn't come to get credit. They came because they care so deeply about these issues, and it really does take a village. So while I certainly appreciate the kudos, we could not have done this without the kind of support that we were given by all of you. So with that, let's move to our next topic. We have a little bit more time before Q&A. I hope you're devising your questions, and if there's something that really comes up that you want to just make sure you get out before you forget what it is, feel free to raise your hand. And at this point, I think we could probably start to take your questions. Kathleen, yes?
Well, I just wanted to, because before we move on to another subject,
Sure.
while we've been talking about the last one, how does harassment not weigh into some of these acts, like against this Somali woman? I mean, harassment's not, and I'm Googling and I'm seeing like different reports of what harassment actually is, but yeah.
Yeah, good question.
Thank you for that question. In Oregon, harassment typically is going to require offensive contact, and you can get there a lot of different ways. It doesn't require a lot of touching. It does, bodily fluid contact is sufficient, and threats that are imminent can be sufficient, but that's why I gave that hypothetical of, I'm going to hurt, well, it wasn't hypothetical, this is the woman's testimony, but like, if I say, I'm going to punch you in the face and I'm right here, then you can start getting into criminal territory on speech alone. So it happens. I mean, there are times where harassment and another crime called menacing can occur just based off of speech. But I'll tell you, they're very hard crimes to prosecute on that alone because of the way the constitutional protections that hang over all the statutes. It doesn't matter how the statute's written. It has to be applied in accordance with the case law. And the case law in this area is very, very tough.
Can you talk about hate-motivated conduct under our sentencing laws?
Okay, sure. The Attorney General asked me to talk a little bit about hate, how hate plays in just on crimes generally, which is a question we get a lot, because our hate crime is actually a little bit misleading. The crime we have that is now bias crime in the first and the second degree, it really only covers misdemeanor conduct. And the reason it does that is because for any felony, if a prosecutor can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that it was motivated by your dislike of a person's protected class status, I murdered them because of blank, it gives the prosecutor the ability to up to double the sentence if they can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. But I will point out that prior to the passage of this bill, we had no idea when prosecutors were doing that. And it's not their fault, it's that their systems weren't built for it. And what that means is, for low-level offenses, we might have a sense of when there was a hate crime. But for the serious stuff, we didn't know how they were being charged, we didn't know how they were being sentenced, we didn't know how they were being supervised, and we didn't know when they were committing hate crimes again. That is all stuff that we will know as a result of this bill.
So is there interest in refining the free speech component?
That is up to the Supreme Court. That is not something the legislature can do. It's something the legislature, yes. It's the Supreme Court of, the main case is a state called State v. Roberts, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards if you want to really go into detail about it. But it's been the main free speech case in Oregon for decades. And we have lost statutes before. We've had the Supreme Court basically say, look, this digs too deeply into speech, so we're not going to permit it. I think the legislature tries to be as protective as they can of people in a climate where speech is generally permitted, but it's a judicial question.
Has it been attempted recently, since 2016?
Via litigation?
No, via legislation.
You can't.
Court litigation.
Yes, and I don't want to get too off on this. The answer is yes, and we can have a conversation about it. I think the most recent example is a statute relating to, which actually we worked on as well, what's called revenge porn, that came out in 2015, and it raises a lot of the same questions about, yes, there was a picture taken of a person that's being uploaded on the internet against their consent. Does that lead to a free speech question or not? And I think that will work its way up in the courts in Oregon and may be something that could move the needle.
Thanks, Kathleen. Okay, so another topic, one that we just wish we didn't have to talk about, but it just seems like every day there's another incident of officer use of force and the issue of police accountability. The recent shooting of Tatiana Jefferson in her home in Fort Worth has renewed this scrutiny of the adequacy of law enforcement training in de-escalation, in conflict resolution, and alternatives to the deployment of lethal force. So, please share your vision, if you would, for law enforcement accountability on this issue in Oregon.
Great, thank you. I would love to ask this one. As a former police officer and a former or retired United States Army veteran, they are distinctively different. The military teaches and trains you to fight a foe, another nation, and you're going there with an expressive direction to destroy. Turn it over to law enforcement is designed to protect and serve. They are distinctly different theories and concepts. So some people, to me, it matters who you hire as a law enforcement officer. And here's the reason why. A lot of people think that because you served in the military, you will make a great law enforcement officer. That's not true. That's not true, because they are trained distinctively different. Law enforcement should be trained to serve and protect, to de-escalate instead of escalating. Right. So what we have done is that we have done a bill that will require all law enforcement agencies, and I even went to DC to talk about it, to undergo a polygraph before hire, a psychological evaluation before hire, a background check before hire. Now, I already know that a polygraph, what that will and will not do. In many cases, a criminal element can be a polygraph. I know that from my experience in law enforcement. However, those would be people that wasn't able to go into the military because whatever reason, and now chose law enforcement as a substitute for an adrenaline rush. Not all. We got a tiny, tiny percent. A tiny, tiny percent. But that tiny, tiny percent is the one that's creating all the chaos. Yeah. It's creating all the confusion. It's making our professionals in uniform look bad. Yep. I will do everything I can to make sure that our law enforcement people out there, professionals, has every tool in their books so that they can go to work and return home safely every night. I will invest in their safety. We put in a plan where if they are feeling that they are overwhelmed, because most of the time when they're called, they're not getting called to Ronald McDonald's parties. They're going to something that has happened, that has a traumatic experience, and they live with these experiences. I still remember the first time that I had a shooting victim. I can still smell the atmosphere. I can still see the victim. These are traumas that they experience. We have to do more, invest in not only their physical well-being, but their mental well-being. If they're in a position where They should not be on the road. They should have an opportunity to do so, be pulled off without any repercussion. I believe that because it's an investment. But by the same token, we need to train more in de-escalation. We need to stop profiling. So we need to make sure that the training, and I think that they're moving toward it now, is more geared back towards the original intent to protect and serve.
So I think my answer is going to crib not just from Senator Frederick's playbook, but also from some thoughts I'd seen expressed in proposed legislation by the good representative from Gresham, Carla Peluso. And this has to do with setting our officers up to succeed. Before I came to work for Ellen, I was a prosecutor in Multnomah County, and I worked on vehiculars, is what we called them, that is basically gnarly felony level traffic offenses. And that would involve driving out in the middle of the night sometimes to go see a body and figure out where they were when they got hit, you know, how fast the car was going. And a lot of that is measured in trauma to the person, what happened to them, what broke, how it broke. And I would come home from those nights, and I didn't know it at the time because no one ever talked to me about that, but I was traumatized. Like, I still see that. And that's just for a prosecutor. Yet for me, that was every blue moon there was a major case. For law enforcement, that's every night. And that trauma has to go somewhere. And you read about officers sometimes, or you see videos where it looks like they just snapped, right? Like 1 second everything was fine, and then the next second the situation was elevating really fast. And some of that is training. Some of that is hiring the right people. Some of that is making sure that these officers are actually getting the care they need to deal with the trauma that we ask them to absorb. And I think a failure to adequately support them can lead to use of force. It can lead to bad decisions. And so, you know, that is not a whole answer, because some of this is about accountability, it's about transparency, it's about rooting out bad actors, but I think some of it is about making sure that our good officers that we ask to walk that line have the tools they need.
I mentioned already the bill that we did in terms of psychological screening. I also mentioned that we had the wellness effort. Those are attempts to deal with some of these situations. The training is going to be an important factor. It is, but it's also, I think the next step is to do what Representative Peluso is talking about, and that is making sure that we are helping officers succeed, because they often don't know that they're carrying around baggage. One of my fellow legislators once told me about a situation where he knew that a particular color blue triggered his anxiety level, and he could not figure out why. He just found himself in a situation where it was something was going wrong. He'd come to a situation, an incident, or he wouldn't be an incident. Just somebody would walk by, and suddenly he would go into anxiety. He finally went and tracked it down by way of talking with a counselor, and discovered that he remembered that that particular color blue was on the T-shirt of a little boy who died in his arms. But he didn't know that because he wasn't. The culture said you don't check on that kind of thing. The culture said you're macho, you don't have to worry about this, you can handle anything. Well, you can't, and we have to figure out how we deal with mental health issues generally in this community, in this culture, but especially with folks who are carrying a weapon and may find themselves anxious and not know why they're anxious, but they need to do something. They're trying to respond to it. So the excessive use of force, the use of force issues are things that we need to be dealing with, and I'll probably have yet another attempt to find a way to define, to better define use of force practices in the next, not the short session, but in the next session. I think that's the key element there, though, is I appreciate that, and I will sign on to your bill if you introduce it again, Carl, because the whole idea that I'm behind is to try to make our community better, and that means everyone in it. So that includes the police officers, it includes other groups that I think need to understand when they are creating more problems. And I could go into a long discussion in terms of education, just general education issues, the school to prison pipeline, the effect. I'll say this simply. One of the concerns I've had for years is that 4th grade black boys get disciplined much higher, much quicker than anybody else in their classroom. And I saw it happen so many times, and my theory was that those 4th grade black boys were now eye to eye with their 4th grade teachers, and they were afraid of them. And they were only disciplined when they were walking down the hall with a strut, or they said something back to the teacher, and that started the path for those folks to go to in terms of the school to prison pipeline. We have to figure out where in our culture we are encouraging this kind of reaction to people of color, especially young black men, frankly.
Thank you so much. At this point, we have about 10 or 15 minutes remaining, and I am going to call for audience questions. Please keep your questions. If you have a comment, that's fine to precede the question, but probably not a speech, okay? Thank you so much. Okay. Go ahead. Yes.
One of the issues that we haven't actually heard much about, and I'll use a more politically safe question, is what would you comment on prosecutorial overzealousness? And in some cases, and I know of cases where this has happened, and do we need something like more standards for prosecutors for trying cases and how they try them, or do we need something like an ombuds's position to review these and provide something? And one of the problems I understand is probably a case is that retroactive getting back to this is much harder for the victim than it is for a prosecutor to defend. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any comments on that.
Sure. Well, I'm the moderator, so I'm going to, you know what moderators get to do. But I will say that before I pass the baton, as you may know, I'm a former judge of actually 22 years, both on the trial and the appellate courts in Oregon. And I would say that, first of all, to prosecute a case, you have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So prosecutors have to, do everything they can to bring in the evidence and prove their case. That doesn't mean that that there might not be going over the line in terms of the word you used, overzealousness. I would focus more on the issue of prosecutorial discretion at the outset in deciding which cases to bring and deciding which types of plea offers or plea agreements are appropriate. And I would also look at some of the various ways in which we are really focusing on justice reinvestment and ways to keep people out of the prison pipeline and the prison system to the extent possible. And prosecutors have a major role to play in that regard. And certainly they have in Oregon, because we gave them, when I was a judge, but Measure 11 passed, and we gave prosecutors way more authority than, frankly, I wish we had. And I'm very glad that we're pulling back on that with respect especially to our juveniles. And we haven't had too much time to get into the juvenile justice conversation, but I have a lot to say about that too, but I'm going to pass this on. Aaron, go for it.
You want it?
No, you go forward, yeah.
Yeah. I guess the buck stops here. Well, look, let me start by saying that I think the importance of the role of prosecutors has not been adequately dealt with by, and I mean, I'm not trying to throw shade at anybody, but here we are at DPO. Who you choose as your prosecutor dictates these results. What I said earlier about how, with, for example, profiling, every stop looks legitimate until you aggregate them together, there is actually no structural reason that a prosecutor couldn't make the decision to open the books on that kind of thing. And this is where data and transparency matter. Hate crimes, for example, we're just now going to get a sense of who's being prosecuted for hate crimes, but any prosecutor at any time would be free to say, look, I'm bringing the community in on this. I want my data to be transparent. And these are the kinds of questions that we need to force on our prosecutors, because what I'll tell you is Prosecutors, like sheriffs, are creatures of the county. The state can do some things, but ultimately this is a local and a county decision as much as it is a legislative decision. And I think we are waking up to how much prosecutors matter and how important those races are for transparency, for equity, for justice. So, pay attention to that race, mobilize in your community on that issue. This stuff really matters.
Well, I'm going to go back to the thing that I mentioned at the very beginning of this time here. What are we evaluating the success of a prosecutor on? Are we evaluating them on the number of arrests, the number of convictions, or are we evaluating them on the effectiveness of their word or their efforts in a particular county? It is important who is the DA. It is important, but if they run their campaign based on how many people they're going to arrest, then that's what they're going to go after. That's how they're going to evaluate how well they've done. And we need to figure out who we are talking about in terms of prosecution. It is what is the future that we want to see in a community, in a county. And we have, as a culture, spent a great deal of time on how many people we arrest and how vigorously and obviously we discipline the folks who have violated the rules. So we've got to rethink that, I think, and that's going to take a bit. But there are a number of people looking out there saying, let's really take a look at the DAs and how who we elect and why. I think that's going to be the important thing.
Oh no, I'm
Yes, my friend from Alabama. Who?
Everyone's pretty much looked at me, but I live in Alabama. I'm from New York, so I gotta give that disclaimer. But no, I've been in Alabama 11 years. I guess my question is really about implicit bias as we talk about how to address.
Can you stand up so we can just hear you a little bit better?
My question is about really implicit bias and tons of work over the last 20 years, especially as we pick juries about what people feel and why they feel it, instead of saying you're a racist or you're a fascist, that you have a set of cultural norms that are a part of you. And every single person has them, and we use that a lot in jury work. And I guess my question for you all, as you talk about modifying the officers that we face, both through selection and other means, is how much work is being done around informing people about their bias, because the study shows people are shown it in a non-confrontational way. They're like, oh my God, I didn't even know I felt this way. Often I tell people to take the Harvard implicit bias test if you've never taken it online, and it'll freak you out, right? You're gonna, and everybody in this room, we think we're awesome, but you'll learn something about yourself if you take this bias test. And so that's my question in this context, is that part of the discussion?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Here in Oregon, we have the Department of Public Safety and Standards Training. They have revamped, or they're in the process of redesigning training programs specifically for law enforcement officers. Implicit bias is a part of that. People need to understand, I agree, they need to understand where their mindset is on any given issue, in particular when it comes to other people that are dissimilar to themselves. That's a huge thing. That's why the psychological evaluation portion that we're doing here in Oregon now is so important. It will help people identify, if nothing else, a counselor or another professional to identify, say, these areas here are concerning. If this is the way that you review this. I've also did some training, simulated training, where I was in law enforcement, and there was a series of events that occurred. One was occurred in a high school, whether or not you use the appropriate use of force or not. Another was walking up on a gentleman that was just in a car. What do you do with that at that particular time? All of them were pretty dangerous, but you don't know that. But if you go into it, like Sandra Blaine, for example, that officer had no business being out there. The thing is, how many times has he did that before? And others. I know for a fact, again, I'm a former police officer, I've seen it happen, and I was able to stop it. So my question would be, is that in order to effectively make change, and I be out and I talk to a lot of people, we can protest all we want, and maybe, perhaps, somebody will hear us. But until we get on the inside and be a part of the system, only then can we effectively make the change. And that's what I would like to see in order to deal with implicit, explicit biases and stuff. We have to get working with people that's similar to us. Case in point, United States Army. I'm a former drill sergeant. Every time I picked up a new class, the first thing I did was find the two people that were so dissimilar from one another, and I matched them up. And my instructions to them was to make sure that you know everything about this man or woman, and vice versa. When I ask you a question, you need to let me know. And what they found out is that they were not so dissimilar. They lived in other places, you know, they come from different backgrounds, but now they had a common bond. They had a common goal. And we need to do that same thing with law enforcement.
So my answer on this will be short, and I was just looking around if by some miracle Jennifer Williamson was here, Representative Williamson, because I'm only 90% on this. But my recollection is House Bill 2355, which was the profiling bill, created a requirement that we train our law enforcement on implicit bias at the academy level, the entry level, at the continuing in-service level, and at the leadership level. That we introduced it into sort of the list of things you have to do and show some competency for in order to get up to that high level. And one of the reasons we felt that is that a lot of this is cultural. You know, it starts at the top and it trickles down. You're right, everybody has implicit bias, but in a structure as hierarchical as a law enforcement agency, if that implicit bias is strongly expressed on the leadership level, it can go right down the line.
Can I just take that
Sure.
back for a moment? So I totally agree with that, but I also want to say that every office that serves the public must include implicit bias training throughout the organization, not just the managers, not just any particular group. Some of you in this room are aware that my office, our wonderful agency, had its own incident just several years ago, and it made us really take a deep look and a deep dive, and we made sure that every single person that worked at the Oregon Department of Justice was properly trained. And what that means is you have to get the right people to do the training as well. And I'm proud to say that we have made some great strides, but we're not there yet. It was a real wake-up call for me. And so I don't want to just deflect and say, you know, the police have to do this or somebody else has to do it. We have to do it. We all have to do it. And as the Attorney General, I truly believe that, and I take responsibility for making sure that gets done. And I'm very proud to say that our Civil Rights Director, who I mentioned earlier, who is, by the way, African American, a veteran, and a lesbian, and a fantastic former judge, former 911 operator, former legal aid lawyer, she is going to the Oregon District Attorneys Association in December and doing the implicit bias and transgender training for the deputy district attorneys and DAs. So that's, I think, an example of how we're trying to walk the talk. But this is not easy stuff. Not everybody wants to come to these classes. And you don't necessarily want to make them required, because then there's kind of this sort of sense of, oh, I have to do it. So you need to find ways to get people there and to get them there as voluntarily as possible, but to make sure that you do the hard work.
I intend to make it required.
Yes.
I want to go a little bit broader. I think we need to look at it in terms of what our culture does. I will give an example. When I was a television reporter, we would do stories on the latest drug information, the newest reports on what was going on in terms of the drug scene. And I had to stand up and say, okay, enough of always showing black guys on the street, because the drugs that are being used were in Portland. We didn't have enough black guys to be doing the drugs in Portland. Okay, there just weren't that many to do all the drugs that were coming through. So every time you do a news story and that's all you show, that gives you a sense of the kind of bias, and it reinforces the problems that we have. That's the kind of approach we need to be looking at. That we need to be looking at it in terms of how we're dealing with kids, and that has an impact that is much larger than simply what happens in terms of arrests or prisons or whatever. It goes down, literally goes down to the molecular level. We now know that the kind of stress related to racism actually has an impact on the telomeres in the cell reproduction. We know that now. And so we know that as a result of that, it creates its own health concerns for black women and and birth and all of it. We know this now. So we need to understand that this is not just something that has a slight response and we can recover from it immediately. We need to begin to direct these things, absolutely direct to immediately to say, okay, we've got to change this now. So I'm just suggesting that this is a much broader issue, but we are able to start looking at it in terms of law enforcement, because that is a very public, visible situation. And if we start looking at it that way, I think we start to see some changes.
It seems appropriate to end with our elder statesman. I had to do it. Hey, let's hear it for our panel. Thank you all so much.